Harry Potter, Squatter. By Enterprise 1701D. A young Harry Potter is abandoned in New York by the Dursleys. He finds his way onto Olympus and starts squatting in an abandoned temple. This story is a development out of one of my shuttlecraft, which in itself came out of a challenge posted by Gabriel Harrell. Thanks go to Thundraman for pointing out where I had originally read the idea. Chapter 1. 7-year-old Harry Potter stared at the $100 note clutched in his small hand. This had to be a trick, right? First, Uncle Vernon allows him to come along on his business trip to the United States, of all places, and then, after an especially rotten deal fell through, he told Harry he'd buy the boy's passport off him for a full $100. When Harry produced said booklet, his uncle actually forked over the money as promised, right before he, Aunt Petunia, and Cousin Dudley got in the car and drove to the airport to go back home. So here he was, standing on the doorstep of the hotel they had been staying in, clutching $100, watching the car disappear into New York traffic. To the average 7-year-old, this situation would be a combination of terrifying and exhilarating. Terrifying because his primary caregivers had just taken off, and exhilarating because $100 is a lot of money. The car was out of sight now, lost in the sea of New York traffic, and Harry started to realize that he had money and that he was free of the Dursleys with no idea what to do now. Turning, he started to walk with no destination in mind. Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia had kept him locked in the hotel room, just as they kept him locked up in their house, and this was his first chance to explore the big city. 8 hours later, he was tired, hungry, and cold when the sun went down and he had no place to stay. He bought a hot dog, a real hot dog, from a street vendor, and made short work of it, taking most of the hunger off. He started to realize that he was in deep trouble, especially now that he had no passport, and his $100 wasn't going to last him very long, especially as he couldn't keep eating hot dogs every day, no matter how good they were, and they had sauerkraut on them, so they were healthy, right? He bought another hot dog from a different vendor. He loved how every street corner had them. What a big difference to Surrey. The sun had completely disappeared by now, and he had no idea where he was going to sleep tonight. For a moment, he thought about asking that pair of police officers he saw walking down the street. Then he noticed the guns, and he remembered how Uncle Vernon had warned him that police officers would put little orphans like him in jail, so he decided against the idea. Better be cold than in jail. As Harry wandered through the city, trying not to be noted, he kept his eyes open. Apparently, he wasn't the only one without a place to sleep, as he saw quite a few other people making do with cardboard boxes or newspapers. The luckier ones had actual blankets. Although sleeping in the big park looked a bit iffy to him, he was more inclined to try the alleys, as some other people did. 2 weeks later, Harry had no money, but he did have a large rolled-up blanket under one arm. He hadn't had a bath in a while, or a meal, but he had learned quickly how to survive, and the large skips that dotted the back alleys were a never-abundant source of both food and useful items. Harry wasn't picky. He hadn't been in a position to be picky at the Dursleys, and that experience helped him now on the streets. As he wandered the streets of Manhattan, he had found some of the most iconic buildings in the world: the magnificent Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, the iconic Flatiron Building that everyone knew by sight but almost none knew by name, and finally, the Empire State Building. When he set his eyes upon it, something drew him closer, a gut feeling. An instinct that told him that this building was more than it appeared to be and that its secrets would be revealed to him if only he knew patience. He walked up to the building and waited in as nonchalant a fashion as he could, leaning against the far older section aid with his rolled-up blanket tucked out of sight behind him. He waited, patiently. He had learned to listen to his instincts, especially after the second night when he had ignored them. A strange man had offered him food and a place to sleep, and he had been hungry, and tired, and cold, and so he ignored the voice of his gut telling him to make a run for it. Harry had barely escaped when the guy suddenly drew a knife after taking him to an apartment, and giving him food. His side, where the knife had scraped, twitched in memory. The wound had closed but hadn't fully healed just yet. That night, Harry had promised to himself to always listen to his gut, and his gut told him to wait outside this building, so he waited. Suddenly, he felt the urge to go inside. He frowned in confusion. Why would he need to go inside? They were going to catch him, hand him over to the police, and throw him in jail. But he had promised, so he pushed off the wall and calmly walked to the front doors of the Empire State. Once inside, he took a good look around, and that same voice told him to walk to the waiting area across from the guard station, as if he were waiting for someone to come down. The guard station was manned lightly, apparently, and the single guard was busy with a visitor, so Harry walked to the comfy seat and sat down. He picked up a magazine and hid himself behind it. He heard the guard step out and walk the visitor to the elevator. The ting of the arriving cart made Harry look up from his magazine. Wait, his instinct surged him. Wait. He waited. The guard stepped into the elevator and did something, but the next moment, a very angry man stepped out from another elevator and called the security guard over. He was obviously trying to remain diplomatic in the face of the torrent of abuse hurled at him by the newcomer, while the visitor stood a few paces away, staring awkwardly at the confrontation. Harry's instinct surged him on. He stood up and walked to the elevator abandoned by the guard, as quickly as he could without drawing attention to himself. A keycard was in the slot of the elevator, and a big, red, shiny, button was visible way at the top of the panel, reading 600. Harry didn't need an incentive from his mysterious gut to push it. Immediately, the doors closed and the elevator started climbing. Raindrops keep falling on my head. Harry tapped his foot impatiently. That elevator music was horrible. The numbers climbed. Harry's foot tapped. The music kept playing. Finally, the elevator dinged its arrival, and the door slid open. Harry stepped out straight away, not a fan of tight and enclosed spaces since his stay in the cupboard underneath Aunt Petunia's staircase, and immediately wished he hadn't done so. He was standing on a narrow stone path that was somehow suspended in the middle of the air. He could see straight down, Manhattan lying deep below, nice and safely on the earth. He jumped up and down once, just to make sure that the mysterious force keeping up the ancient stone walkway wasn't going to let up just as he was crossing it. Apparently, it wasn't, as the stones beneath his feet felt as solid as any walkway on earth was. Just where was he? Dragging his eyes away from the floating walkway, and Manhattan below it, he looked to where it went. Apparently, the stone path ended in a set of white marble steps that curled around a cloud, up further into the sky. Somehow, Harry realized that this was both real and solid, and out of this world. Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia had always called him a freak when he did something freaky, like turn his teacher's hair blue without touching her, or growing his hair back overnight after Aunt Petunia cut it all off. A wide smile grew on Harry's face. This was a place for freaks like him. Here, he could do all the freaky stuff he wanted, and nobody would shout at him for it. He looked back down at the cobblestone pathway beneath his feet, floating in midair. Was this the sort of stuff he would learn if he hung around here? That would be awesome. He followed the pathway and started climbing the steps up the cloud, looking up to where they led as he did so, and he stopped climbing, his mouth dropping open on its own accord. From the top of the clouds rose a mountain with a flat peak, the top of which was covered in snow. Attached to the side of the mountain were palaces, for the lack of a better word, all of them with multiple levels, and white marble columns and gilded terraces. Light was provided by braziers that held real fires instead of lights, braziers that edged winding roads that went in a crazy fashion up the slopes of the mountain. It looked like those pictures found in history books, built by Greeks and Romans, only shiny and new. As Harry stared at the palatial city, he drew a deep breath and collected himself. He was going to stick out like a sore thumb, with his threadbare clothes and his lack of bathing. Just what was he to do now? He looked back. The elevator had disappeared, obviously having been recalled to the ground floor. He realized that it would soon be returning with the man the guard was going to let up originally. He had no choice, raced up the steps, into the city, and ducked into the nearest shadowy hiding spot he could find. It took him quite some time to calm his racing heart, but when he finally managed to do so, his stomach let him know that it hadn't eaten in quite some time. Clutching the blanket that he had managed to keep hold of in the excitement, Harry tried to figure out what to do next. The people here may be freaks like him, but their houses certainly showed that they had lots of money, and they would not like him strolling through their magnificent city dressed the way he was. He slipped from shadow to shadow, trying to explore the city without drawing attention to himself. He saw wonderful things, beautiful things, and signs of freakishness that made his heart ache with longing to try them himself. He was sure that quite a few of the city's dwellers had noticed him. The curious eyes meeting his were a dead giveaway, but for some reason, most of them only spared him a look or two and then went on their way. Perhaps they believed him to be one of them, and playing a game of sorts. They certainly hadn't yelled at him to go away, thrown things at him, or turned him into a frog with their powers. Slipping from the shadow, Harry decided to try and see what happened. He walked into the middle of the road, and acted as if he belonged there. All the people he came across, beautiful men and even more beautiful women, dressed in bright white togas and adorned with gold, merely glanced curiously at him, and then decided to leave him be. He wasn't stopped for conversation. He wasn't shouted at to go away. Wondering what that was about, he ignored the curious looks and followed the road he was on to wherever it was lead him. He arrived at a market square, filled with multicolored tents that held vendors selling all kinds of things. His stomach rumbled, but Harry had no more money. He watched how one man paid a vendor with gold. Even if Harry still had some money, something told him these vendors weren't about to accept US dollars. A pretty girl, 4 or 5 years older than him, paid with a handful of silver and bronze coins. Now what was he supposed to do? The girl turned away from the vendor, having stowed her purchase, and looked curiously at him. He gave her a tentative smile. She looked surprised, then gave him a hesitant smile in return, and walked away. Even if nobody talked to him, at least they weren't shouting. That was a bonus. He wondered what they were all thinking when they looked at him. They certainly looked puzzled enough, but accepted him easily after a few curious looks. Not having any money to buy food, he left the market and went in look of a good place to spread out his blanket and go to sleep. There were vast gardens, but they were filled with olive trees and rose bushes. One meant a lot of open space where he could be seen sleeping, the other means lots of thorns, so the gardens were out. He stayed away from the top of the mountain, where the largest mansions were. He didn't want to push his luck. He followed the small roads, trying to see where they would lead, trying to figure out a good place to sleep. On one of those roads, he arrived in an area that appeared to have been maintained far less. There was a lot of dust on the porches of these houses, and there was nobody around at all. Looking around, he decided on a house at random, and tried the door, or rather, doors. Like with all other houses he'd seen, this house held a large double door as an entrance, like you'd see in a church. He tried them, and found them unlocked. Looking left and right and left again just to be sure, he opened the door a crack and slipped inside. He arrived in a large entrance hall that was at least 2 or 3 stories tall, and dominated by a large statue standing in the middle of it. He didn't know why, but somehow Harry felt as if the statue were glaring at him, and he felt incredibly unwelcome, a bit like opening the door and entering Aunt Petunia's house. Harry thought, "Sorry to bother you, Mr. Statue," Harry said, politely. He looked around, and found the inside of the house to be even more dusty than the streets outside had been. "But would it be alright if I stayed here for a bit?" The oppressive feeling intensified, and Harry started to feel rather uncomfortable. He started to wonder if this statue was magical and if it were going to start shouting at him the way Aunt Petunia always did. "I can clean the house while I stay here," Harry offered. "Aunt Petunia makes me do the housework, and I'm pretty good at it." The oppressive feeling wavered, as if thinking things over, and suddenly Harry felt really warm and safe, and the house felt like it was welcoming him. It was something completely new to the boy, and it surprised him. He smiled at the statue. "Thanks, Mr. Statue." Why did Harry suddenly feel like someone patted his back in approval? Shaking off the strange feeling, Harry examined the statue a bit better. The man looked incredibly well built, better than anything Harry had ever seen in picture books. In fact, it looked as if Michelangelo had examined this statue and then made a rather poor copy of it when he sculpted his David. The statue stood in a strange pose, with legs spread shoulder wide, his left hand, balled into a fist, on his side, and the other arm outstretched, holding up a golden ball. Looking further, the boy found that there was writing on the base upon which Mr. Statue stood. To his surprise, the letters didn't seem to dance up and down, like the letters on the pages of the books in school did, but he still couldn't read them properly. They were weird, like someone had tried to write English letters while drunk. Shaking off the strange lettering, he looked around the large entry hall. It ran to the top of the house and the roof was made of glass or something equally transparent, as Harry could see the sky above, with the large sun beaming down. The rest of the hall was pretty empty, except for a marble table that stood in front of Mr. Statue. Turning around, Harry walked past the statue and deeper into the house. The rest was like a normal house, 3 stories, connected with stairs. The layout was open floor, with the roof supported by columns. Everywhere he was, he could see Mr. Statue's imposing form. On the ground floor, there appeared to be a fireplace, complete with a pile of dried firewood next to it, as well as metal tools needed to poke the fire and clean it out. There also appeared to be a cooking area, a dining area, and a sitting area. The various rooms were marked off with furniture of different kinds. At the back of the house, right out the back door, was a covered-over area that held a large pool, fed by a waterfall coming from the large mountain that dominated the city. Yet more marble columns held up the roof. Unable to help himself, Harry leaned down and felt the water. It was warm. There must be hot springs or something nearby. Going back inside, and up the stairs to the second floor, Harry was beyond ecstatic to find a real bed, as well as various cabinets to hold clothes and other supplies. To his disappointment, the closets and cabinets were empty. He'd have to find a way to get some supplies. He may be able to use the pool and waterfall outside to wash, but without soap, he wasn't about to get clean. Washing his clothes would be a problem, as well. The second floor was open floor as well, with a large relaxing and sitting area flowing into the sleeping area, with another fireplace. He climbed the stairs to the top floor, and found another bedroom. He could have a guest, not that he had any friends to invite over, but now he had room for one if he ever got one. The top floor was furnished less richly than the second floor, and Harry guessed this was some kind of guest bedroom, even when Mr. Statue had used the house himself. For a few moments, he leaned against the railing that separated the top floor from the large atrium, staring at Mr. Statue's back. He wondered who had designed the place, as this definitely didn't fit any norms he knew of, and it definitely wasn't something he'd design himself. The place didn't even have a bathroom, well, other than a hot pool out back, and that was only for washing himself. He didn't see any electricity, nor any appliances to do laundry with, nor did he see a toilet. That was going to get awkward. His stomach grumbled, and Harry pushed away from the railing, making his way downstairs. He kept an eye out for cleaning utensils. He was determined to keep his promise to Mr. Statue, and having a broom or a mop would help. He didn't find anything, unfortunately. Harry sighed. This was going to be a problem. The house held furniture, very comfortable furniture, but it was lacking everything that he needed to make actual use of it. No bathroom, no utensils, no appliances, not even a bar of soap. The cupboards in the kitchen were as bare as the cabinets in the bedrooms had been. Harry sighed. Of course they were bare. Who knew how long it had been since the house had actually been used? Looks like he'd have to go dumpster diving. He walked to the front doors, and turned to face the statue. "Hi, Mr. Statue," he chirped. "I'll be right back. I just have to go and dig up some food." Maybe I can even find an old mop or a broom to get started on cleaning the house." He didn't feel anything out of the ordinary, and just waved at the statue as he left, making sure to firmly close the large double doors behind him. Looking around, he oriented himself, wanting to make sure he could find this house again after he had found something to eat. The sun had gone down by the time Harry returned, looking dejected. It seemed that this beautiful city had something against dumpsters, as he hadn't been able to find a single one. Nobody seemed to throw anything away, and it would make living off the land difficult for him. He felt bad about the loaf of bread that he was carrying. He'd been forced to swipe it off the table of merchant in the market square while he was busy with another customer. He really didn't want to steal, but he was so very hungry. He slipped back inside. With the sun down, the house was extremely dark, the only light coming from the lighted braziers that lined the road, their light streaming in through the open front door. When the door closed behind him, he was in total darkness. Harry waited a bit, hoping that his night vision would improve and let him see. While it doubtlessly improved, he still couldn't see. It was as if the house had been sealed off from light now that the sun was down. Silently, he edged his way inside, and stumbled into the marble table that was standing in front of Mr. Statue's statue. With his free hand, he wiped it as best he could, and put the loaf down. Turning, he made his way back to the front doors, and pulled both of them open to allow the light of the braziers to filter inside. He wondered how he was going to light the house. Leaving the front doors open wasn't something that he was willing to do. Suddenly, he had a thought. Cloaked in the half-light filtering in through the front doors, rather than being in total darkness, Harry made his way to the hearth, where he remembered firewood having been stacked. He found the longest, thickest piece of wood in the pile, extricated it, and made his way outside. Standing on his tiptoes, he reached with the wood to the brazier and waited for it to catch. Finally, with a makeshift torch, he went back inside and closed the front doors. The fire danced merrily as he retrieved his loaf of bread, only to find that half of it was missing. He blinked, then looked up at the statue. "Were you hungry, too, Mr. Statue?" he asked. "I'm sorry, I didn't know statues could even get hungry. Thanks for leaving me some, though. I'll bring some more for you tomorrow." There was a strangely comforting feeling, and Harry retrieved his half-loaf and went inside. Lighting the hearth was easy enough now that he had a burning torch, and soon he was munching his bread while watching the fire. The bread tasted strange, better than any bread he'd ever had before. He knew he wouldn't be able to survive on bread alone, and was pondering what to do next, staring into the fire as he did so. Suddenly, the flames of the fire leapt up, turning deeper, darker shades. As the fire seemed to jump out of the fireplace, he let out a shout that was part surprise and part fear. Before he knew it, he was halfway from behind him, to the cooking area, when he heard a whoosh, thinking that the fire was now burning further into the sitting area, probably engulfing the couch he had been sitting on. He dropped and hid behind the nearest cabinet, before carefully looking over the top to see the damage. Instead of damage, he saw a girl, probably a year or two older than him, with brown hair and dressed in simple robes, examining the sitting area. She picked up the loaf he had been eating, and he suddenly realized he had dropped it in his frantic effort to get away from the fire. He glanced at the fireplace. It was burning normally again. What had happened? Had the girl walked out of the fire? Was that why it had scared him with its strange behavior? He ducked back down behind the cabinet when he saw the girl turn to look in his direction. He wasn't going to get caught. He needed to get away. Sure, Mr. Statue had indicated he could stay, but he wasn't about to try and explain to someone else that the statue had done so. They'd think he was crazy. "I know someone is here," the girl said. Her voice sounded gentle, and just a little bit teasing. "After all, the hearth is burning and there is a half-eaten loaf of bread sitting here." Harry cursed to himself. She was going to find him, and the lack of walls in this house meant that she would see him if he tried to run. Now what was he going to do? He heard her sandals on the stone floor as she walked, then he heard the leather of the couch when she sat down. "I'm not here to harm you," she said again. Her voice sounded warm. Maybe he could trust her. I came because this hearth hasn't been used in a very long time, the mysterious girl said. That explained what the girl was doing here, Harry decided, but he wondered if others would be able to do the same thing. If she could do it, while being only a few years older than him, then the grown-ups would be able to do the same thing, right? He definitely didn't want the grown-ups to know. They'd yell at him and try to hit him for stealing that bread. He'd heard that before, even if her voice was warm and gentle and didn't sound like someone who would hurt him. My name is Hestia, the girl said, while Harry was sitting behind his cabinet, trying to calm himself and trying to think his way out of trouble. I'm not here to harm you. If that is what you are worried about, I won't tell anyone else you're here either, Hestia said. That's great, Harry thought, but what if they find out by themselves? Hestia stood up, judging from the sound of the couch. You can trust me, I won't tell anyone, and nobody will be able to find you here. Her footsteps trailed off and then vanished entirely. Her voice soothed him. Despite himself, he glanced over the side of the cabinet, curious to see what the girl, Hestia, was doing. To his immense surprise, he stared directly into a pair of brown eyes. He yelped loudly and threw himself backwards, while the girl stifled a laugh. It was a lovely laugh, Harry realized, while sitting on his behind, trying to keep his heart from jumping out of his chest. That wasn't funny, he declared. Yes it was, Hestia said, smiling at him. What's your name, Harry? Harry said morosely, while standing up. Don't be mad, Harry, it's just a harmless joke, Hestia said, still smiling at him. She turned to the sitting area. Won't you sit with me? He shrugged, still not sure about this strange girl that popped out of the fire and then scared him. He followed her, and sat down on the other end of the couch, not sure what to do or say. Hopefully she wouldn't turn him in. I'm Hestia, Hestia said again. I'm the goddess of the hearth and the home. He blinked. A goddess? Was that why she walked out of the fire? He glanced at the fireplace. Yes, that hearth, Hestia said with a small laugh, that same laugh that had calmed him earlier, among all the others. That's why I knew someone was here, despite this temple not having been used in a very long time. It's also why I could come. If I don't share my findings, nobody else will know. He relaxed. That explained why she offered to keep him a secret. So you won't tell? Hestia still had that gentle smile. No, Harry, I won't, she told him. He let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. Won't you tell me how you got here? She asked. Harry looked at her, feeling weary. Promise me you won't tell any adults? He asked, just to make sure. Hestia looked surprised for a moment, followed by a look of realization. She smiled at him, and Harry suddenly felt warm. I promise I won't tell anyone without your permission, she reassured him. Harry was silent for a few moments, studying her. She looked normal, for the lack of a better word. Plain brown robes, brown eyes, brown hair. Her skin was a shade deeper than the pasty white most English people had. He decided to trust her. If she didn't keep her promise, he would just have to run. No way was he going back to Aunt Petunia now that he'd felt freedom. His silence must have clued Hestia in on his thoughts. I can swear to it, if you wish, she offered. Harry pulled himself from his thoughts. Isn't that the same thing? He asked. Hestia's smile grew slightly, and she edged closer to him, as if about to explain some great secret. Despite himself, he leaned in to hear her explanation. Not to us gods, she confided. We can swear on the river Styx. To break an oath made on the Styx is to invite calamity and misfortune on yourself. Harry frowned. What does that mean? He asked, not understanding. It means that, if you make an oath, and don't hold to it, bad things will happen to you, a lot of bad things. Swearing an oath on the Styx is the most serious promise a god can make. Harry nodded, understanding what she was trying to say. He also understood that she was offering to make such a promise to him. You don't have to swear, he said, just promise you won't tell a grown-up. She smiled at him. I promise, she reassured him. Can you tell me why? She asked gently, Because adults yell and scream and throw stuff at me, Harry answered before he realized what he was saying. Adults are bad, they never believe you, and trust other people, so they always think you're bad when you're not. Hestia looked sad at his explanation. Not all adults are like that, she offered. Harry shrugged. Maybe you've got a good mom and dad, Hestia, but I just have Aunt Petunia and Uncle Vernon, and they hate me, and all the adults talk to them first, so they all hate me, too. So please don't tell an adult. Hestia was smiling again. But it was sad now. I promise, she said. Again, can you tell me more about your aunt and uncle? How did you come to live with them? Harry sighed. My parents were drunks that died in a car crash, the young boy explained. Aunt Petunia said so. I was dumped with her and Uncle Vernon because nobody else would have me. They didn't want me, but had to take me. I didn't like it with them. They were always yelling and screaming and threw me in my cupboard if something went wrong. Your cupboard? Hestia asked. Harry nodded. It's where I slept, my cupboard under the stairs. Suddenly, the kind and sweet Hestia looked really dangerous, with glowing eyes filled with fire and her hair turning the same red as the flames in the fireplace, but it only lasted for a moment and she looked normal again. It happened so quick that Harry just assumed it had been a trick of the light from the fireplace.